Imagine watching your ship die in slow motion. Not from enemy fire, not from a storm you can outrun, but from ice that moves with the patience of a continent. Wood groaning, beams twisting, the hull squeezed until it finally gives up. And then imagine stepping off that ship onto a frozen ocean with no radio, no rescue plan, and only one promise that sounds impossible. Everyone goes home. This is the true story of Ernest Shackleton and the Endurance Expedition, a journey that failed in its original goal, but became one of the greatest survival and leadership legends in human history. It was 1914. The world was sliding toward the First World War, and the age of polar exploration was still burning with ambition. Antarctica had already proven it could make heroes, and destroy them in the same breath. Shackleton wanted to do something even bigger than reaching a pole. He wanted the first crossing of the Antarctic continent from coast to coast, a route that would demand endurance in every sense of the word. He chose a ship that seemed to carry fate in its name, Endurance. 28 men boarded her. Sailors, scientists, engineers, carpenters, dog handlers. Their skills were practical, but their hopes were romantic. Some were hardened by the sea. Some were young and hungry for adventure. All of them believed they were heading into a chapter of history that would be written in bold ink. For a while, the expedition felt like a dream with a map. The Endurance pushed into the Weddell Sea. The horizon became a stunning, indifferent white. The cold was constant, but manageable. The ice was present, but not yet threatening. Then the pack ice began to close like a slow fist. The ship tried to fight forward. The propellers churned. The crew worked the engines. Men with poles and saws battled the ice at the edges. But Antarctica doesn't respond to effort. It responds to physics. By early 1915, the Endurance was trapped. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. The men lived with a unique kind of fear, the fear of waiting. Because in Antarctica, waiting is not rest. It is a countdown. On a trapped ship, the mind becomes its own climate. There is cabin fever, yes, but also something deeper, the slow erosion of certainty. Each morning you wake up and ask the same quiet question: has our world changed overnight? Is the ice looser or tighter? Are we closer to freedom or closer to being crushed? Shackleton understood that their greatest enemy wasn't only the cold, it was what the cold could do to the mind. So, he kept the men active. He assigned routines. He insisted on meals together. He encouraged games and small celebrations. He pushed small rituals of normal life into a place that was anything but normal. Morale, he knew, was a survival tool. Then the ice decided the next chapter. The pressure built until the ship started to crack. The Endurance groaned like a living thing under torture. Planks warped. Water crept in. The sound of destruction echoed through the hull with every shift of the pack. The men pumped, repaired, and prayed, but the ice was stronger than wood, stronger than stubbornness, stronger than hope. Finally, Shackleton gave the order no captain ever wants to utter: abandon ship. The mission died that day. But the men did not. They carried supplies onto the ice and set up camp on a frozen surface that was never truly stable. Imagine living on a floor that slowly drifts through darkness, listening for the sound of cracks beneath your feet. They salvaged what they could: food, fuel, tents, tools, navigational equipment, the lifeboats that now mattered more than the ship itself. There were also moments of quiet beauty that made the nightmare bearable. The men took photographs and recorded observations, trying to preserve a sense that their lives still had meaning beyond survival. The expedition's photographer, Frank Hurley, worked fiercely to save images from the wreck and later from the ice, because even in disaster the story mattered. Those photographs would become some of the most haunting records of polar exploration, showing a proud ship pinned in an endless white world. Small choices now became massive. How much gear could they carry without slowing themselves to death? Which scientific samples? Which personal items? Which luxuries of identity could be sacrificed? A book might be comfort one day and useless weight the next. A single stove could mean the difference between hot food and hypothermia. Survival here wasn't a heroic sprint. It was thousands of tiny decisions made under pressure, with no guarantee that any decision would be enough. The dogs had been part of the expedition's original plan for the crossing, and now they were also companions in isolation. That bond mattered. It made the camp feel slightly more alive. But as time passed and conditions worsened, survival demanded ruthless decisions, the kind you never plan to face when you sign up for adventure. Food was rationed. Hunting became necessary. The cold was a knife that never took a break, and the wind carried a message that never changed. You are far from home. They waited again. But now, with the weight of homelessness, their ship sank and disappeared beneath the ice, leaving them in a world where the rules of survival became primitive and personal. Hunt what you can. Save what you must. Endure what you cannot change. Months passed in a strange limbo. The men drifted on the ice northward, like castaways on a moving island. The camps changed names, reflecting the mood of the moment. The quiet hope that they might march to safety. The realization that the ice was too rough. The acceptance that their best chance was to let the drift carry them closer to open water. Shackleton continued to manage the invisible war inside the group. He rotated duties to prevent resentment. He watched for signs of despair. He kept conflicts small. He made hope an obligation rather than an emotion. When the men argued, he separated them. When someone seemed to sink into darkness, he found that person a purpose. Leadership here looked less like grand speeches and more like careful daily choices. Eventually, the ice beneath them began to fracture. This was not a warning. It was eviction. Shackleton ordered the lifeboats prepared. 3 small boats were all that stood between them and the sea. They launched into freezing water filled with jagged ice that could puncture the hulls in seconds. The Southern Ocean did not welcome them. Waves slammed the boats. Spray froze on their clothes. Exhaustion dragged at their arms. Navigation was a desperate dance between survival and exhaustion. Every mile earned felt like a small rebellion against nature. After days of struggle, they reached a hard sliver of safety. Elephant Island. Elephant Island was not a home. It was a rock at the edge of nowhere. No shipping lanes. No easy way to signal help. A place where rescue would not arrive by accident. The men built a rough shelter from overturned boats and whatever material they had left. They huddled together for warmth. They ate what they could find. They tried to keep their bodies working, because when the body stops in that kind of cold, the mind can follow quickly. They repaired clothing. They rationed fuel. They waited for daylight and weather windows to hunt. They checked the horizon so often that the act became a ritual. And in that fragile shelter of shared body heat, they discovered that community can be a life support system. The most dangerous question settled into the air. What if the world never finds us? Shackleton refused to let that question become their final truth. He made a decision that sounded insane, and yet was the only path with a real chance. He would take a small crew and sail one of the lifeboats to South Georgia, a whaling island more than 800 miles away across one of the most violent seas on Earth. Think about what that means. Not a modern boat, not a trained rescue vessel, a reinforced lifeboat, a handful of navigational instruments, and a team whose bodies were already exhausted. The plan was not safe. It was simply the least hopeless option left. The lifeboat was named James Caird. They reinforced it with anything they had. Wood, canvas, improvised ceiling. It was still a tiny craft facing a monstrous ocean. Shackleton chose 5 men to accompany him. The rest would remain on Elephant Island, under the leadership of Frank Wild, who was given a simple, heartbreaking instruction: keep them alive until I return. When Shackleton left in the James Caird, he wasn't just sailing for rescue. He was carrying the psychological weight of every man who watched him depart. If he failed, the island would become a tomb. If he succeeded, the island would become a testament. That is why the James Caird voyage feels so mythic. It wasn't only the sea they were crossing. It was the distance between despair and possibility. The James Caird set out into what many sailors considered the worst water on the planet. For 17 days, the men lived in a world of salt, wind, and fear. Their clothes never properly dried. Salt water burned their skin. Their hands split and bled. Their bodies trembled with cold and hunger. Sleep was shallow and dangerous. A single mistake could flip the boat or send it onto rocks. Navigation was an act of near miraculous precision, and Captain Frank Worsley's skill may have been the difference between life and oblivion. In an ocean with almost no landmarks, he relied on brief windows of clear sky to take readings. The margin of error was terrifying. Too far north, and they would miss the island. Too far south, and they would be swallowed by ice and storm. When they finally saw the mountains of South Georgia rising from the sea, it must have felt like waking from a nightmare into a different kind of test. They landed on the wrong side of the island, far from the whaling stations. The sea had delivered them, but not to salvation. So Shackleton, Worsley, and Tom Crean did the next unthinkable thing. They crossed the island's interior on foot, through mountains and glaciers that had barely been mapped. They carried minimal gear. They climbed, slid, and navigated a frozen maze for more than 30 hours without real rest. The terrain was steep, the weather unpredictable, and the risk absolute. If one of them broke a leg, the story would end right there. And then, in one of the most surreal moments in exploration history, 3 ragged men emerged into a whaling station. The sight of them was so shocking that workers struggled to recognize what they were seeing. Shackleton had reached help, but his mind was still on Elephant Island. Rescue was not immediate. Ice blocked routes. Multiple attempts failed. The ocean remained a barrier that seemed determined to keep the story from ending well. Each failure meant more waiting for the men left behind, more danger, more doubt. Back on Elephant Island, Frank Wild fought his own war. He rationed food. He kept morale alive with discipline and routines. He set expectations for order, because even small standards can protect a group from psychological collapse. He reportedly told the men to pack their things every morning, because the boss might arrive today. That daily act of belief turned waiting into action. Finally, in August 1916, a ship broke through the ice and approached the island. The men who had been stranded for months watched the silhouette grow larger, unwilling to trust their eyes. Shackleton stepped ashore and began counting. 22 men on Elephant Island, 6 on the James Caird journey, 28 men in total, not one life lost. The Endurance expedition did not cross Antarctica. It did not plant flags on the far side of the continent, but it achieved something rarer than conquest. It proved that leadership can be measured not by the victory you claim, but by the people you refuse to abandon. Shackleton's genius was not only strategic, it was human. He understood that survival is as much a psychological battle as a physical one. He knew when to be gentle and when to be firm. He knew how to protect hope without lying about danger. He knew that in the coldest places on Earth, the warmth that matters most is the bond between people. That is why this story became immortal. Because sometimes history doesn't crown the conquerors. Sometimes it crowns the leader who brings everyone home. So the next time you hear the word endurance, remember that it was not just a ship. It became a definition. A reminder that even when the mission collapses, even when the map is useless, even when nature makes survival feel like a joke, there is still a kind of victory that matters more than any record. You don't have to reach the summit to become legendary. Sometimes, the greatest triumph is simply this: no one gets left behind.